Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. This episode of Changing Higher Ed is sponsored by Perdea Education, a national leader in online student recruitment and enrollment services, providing institutions enrolled students risk-free on a performance-based model with no long-term contract. If your online programs could benefit from incremental online student enrollments, visit PerdeaEducation.com. That's P-E-R-D-I-A education.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Dr. Paul Friga. Paul is one of the foremost public higher education thought leaders and strategists, with over 20 years of experience as a professor, researcher, and consultant at UNC Chapel Hill and Indiana University, as well as experience as a consultant with PwC, McKinsey, and now AGB. Paul understands how public education really works and how it should change. And he joins us today to talk about strategies for change in higher ed for surviving the COVID crisis, including what higher ed institutions should and shouldn't be doing with the stimulus money they are receiving as part of the American Rescue Plan that was signed into law this month.
Paul, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here, Drumm. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to this. We're going to talk about the latest recovery plans that are going on and how this is going to help higher ed or maybe even hurt it. Who knows?
I hope it's the former, but I fear it could be the latter.
Well, if people use this to go back to the status quo, it's definitely going to be the latter.
Agreed.
We've got the American Rescue Plan, almost $40 billion to higher ed institutions, a lot of changes with that. Maybe give us a little context on how this has worked in the past and how it might work going forward.
Sure. At the surface level, everyone would be totally delighted that the federal government is supporting higher ed. We'd love to see that kind of support. I wrote an article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. It was How Congress Can Save Higher Ed. I wrote it last spring when the pandemic hit. And I've done some research on the impact of COVID on higher ed and did some calculations. It could be north of $180 billion to the negative. That's lost revenues, 14% on average per institution, additional expenses due to COVID on campus of up to $24 billion and $70 billion in state funding. But all of that is really hurt institutions, but in some ways, in terms of making changes, could have actually helped them by making them realize they could be more efficient, that perhaps they can get things done in new ways. And some would claim that higher ed's a little overdue for change, Drumm.
Oh, most definitely. My friend Gordon Gee has said to me multiple times, COVID is accelerating needed changes in higher ed by a decade or more.
And I agree with that. In fact, interviewed him for a Chronicle website and did an article as well. And he said it's an existential time for us to see what kind of changes and what we're really about, take us to our core, and make sure we focus on the key things we do. But back to the federal topic, you know, if you go all the way back to the CARES Act, I mean, for once, Congress actually acted quickly and provided funding. The first act, which came in March of last year, was $14 billion. About half of that, Drumm, goes, as you know, to students, and then half went to institutions. So there's $7 billion. And then in December, another act, the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, was about $24 billion, with $12 billion going to institutions. So you got $19 billion to institutions. Now, as you mentioned, this one is $40 billion. Again, about half of it goes to students, which I think is terrific, and grant money and relief money, and because they're really struggling to make ends meet. So you got $20 billion. So adding that together, you're about $40 billion. But again, my calculations show that the losses could be close to 180. So it's not going to cover. There still has to be cuts that universities have to make to keep ends meet. And sometimes those ends aren't going to meet. And they're going to have to go to endowments or have carry forwards of losses that are the most significant we've had in the history of higher ed.
Most definitely. And when you take a look at the job losses, 650,000 job losses in higher ed alone. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, the actions that most institutions have taken, I've done a pretty significant research study on this. The most common were furloughs, were freezes to no hires, which essentially is a decrease in hiring because every year higher ed was just adding more FTEs and then having higher increases in tuition with more government subsidies. Well, that's a model just on its surface when about half of them were not even meeting operating budgets, and so they're at a negative deficit, to just continue to hire people and continue to expand without putting things in check and without really watching your expenses very closely. Some were, of course, especially public institutions that were being hit with decreases in support. But the losses, over 600,000, a lot of those were furloughs, not permanent layoffs. That was because students weren't on campus, so they didn't need all the facility support and campus support. But also there were some layoffs, and in some institutions, they actually went in and made real changes to decrease faculty levels, especially in programs that perhaps had lower students or lower enrollments than others. And maybe they were thinking of doing something like that in the past, but now they have a chance to do it here. So lots of changes on campuses as a reaction to the decreased resources.
I think these changes need to happen. I read, last month or something like this, that back in the early 2010s, there was a whole glut of new programs coming online, figuring this is the best way to get new students. But about 2/3 of them never realized the potential that they had expected. So why wouldn't you want to cut those?
Yeah, and student to faculty ratios have been decreasing over time without a real strategic intent and not a real active program management. I think you know this, Drumm, in higher ed. It's very easy to start a program, but very hard to kill a program. And so as a result, you just have very high instructional costs. You have redundant costs of multiple types of faculty on campus who are, teaching certain hours, more faculty-driven than student-driven. You haven't fully integrated online, both in residential programs plus successful for new student growth. So all of that has added up to increased academic and administrative costs per student rather than decreasing costs. And that's what happens in most industries. You examine, you look for efficiencies, and then you grow. The growth, it isn't just more of the same, but it's growing in different areas, growing in new programs, growing in creative ways that serve differently.
And programs that have good market research behind them. I think a lot of folks bring programs on, not so much with market research, but faculty say, hey, I've got this expertise in XYZ area. Let's start a program around this.
Yeah, I call those programs faculty driven. And for a while, those were fine. But with increased costs and needs to balance budgets, it's difficult to just do those based on interest of faculty. Some faculty resist what you're saying, Drumm, to be adjusting to the market, but that's indeed what has to happen. We have to get closer to the folks who are hiring our students, to the ones who are funding research, looking for more applied research outcomes, and really shifting to the needs of society.
Becoming part of what's called the talent supply chain.
That's right. And, corporations are going to be much closer to universities in the future, both in terms of designing programs, of benefiting from programs. There's a big movement toward lifelong learning, and universities have to shift beyond just the 4-year traditional you're in and out kind of things. Now, graduate programs, of course, are different than that, but certificate programs, new ways of re-engaging executive education, all of that's going to grow and change the way universities and industry work together.
And it should. I mean, if you take a look at American industry back in the late 80s, early 90s, with all of the changes it went through, higher ed is now starting to go through those same type of changes, this reinventing America.
Yeah, and back to the funds, this is a chance for us to make some much overdue changes, as we started to alluding to. And so it kind of begs a question, Drumm, and I know you and I talked about this in preparing for the session. When you were saying, is this going to be good or bad news? If we go down the path of why did I say it could be bad? I hoped it wouldn't. But here's what I fear the money could be used for. Almost like recommendations for what not to use this federal money for when it starts coming in, and including the December money, Drumm, that's coming in too.
So this is the big one that you put the X across it and say, don't go here.
Yeah, and I'm really afraid that it's the default tendency to go here. So let me explicitly lay some of these out from my opinion. And it almost like reverses some of the moves they made during the pandemic which I think were probably positive moves. And what they should be doing, and we'll talk about how to use it, is to be using it for strategic purposes, not just going back, as you mentioned, to status quo. So here are a couple of things to avoid. Raises. This isn't a celebration time that we should just go give more money back to employees. Pay cuts, especially leadership pay cuts, were a pretty big move during the pandemic to help make things meet. Well, maybe we overstated our past pay. I mean, the rise in administrative pay and administrative positions, assistant provost, assistant chancellor, assistant to the associate provost. I mean, these things have grown very much over time. Some places due to government regulations and compliance issues, but other times, again, just like programs, easy to start a position, very hard to kill it. Same thing with pay. Pay has gone up over time without really being in check. Now, you would say there's a market for this, but we shouldn't just immediately go back to paying our leaders more. Another one I worry about is just refilling all past positions. So if we had a position formed and we didn't refill it, that doesn't mean we need it now, both administrative and academic. The hiring freezes were great, but don't just then give carte blanche to say, well, whatever you think you need. Now's the time to really do an assessment, do benchmarking. My old firm, ABC Insights, which was bought by Helio Campus, really helps institutions say, how many people do we need in that type of position when we compare to others? And that's not done extremely well in higher ed. So be very careful and use data for refilling past positions. Physical infrastructure, I personally believe that we have overinvested in that. It was a bit of an arms race as a driver for admissions. You can understand why it happened to keep up with the Joneses. But now, when enrollments are dropping, especially we're going to see a 15% decrease in traditional high school students over the next 8 years. We're not going to be operating at the same level of enrollments. So we have overbuilt our physical infrastructure. So it's not a time now to be returning to that type of investment. So those are just a few things. Drumm, you have some thoughts about what we shouldn't be investing in?
Well, I'm all for more climbing walls.
And lazy rivers.
And lazy rivers, absolutely. No, I think you hit on some really good points there, Paul. The returning to the status quo doesn't make sense. We've been given a gift on how to change things that need to be done. So institutions should be taking deep dives as to what is really needed going forward. And of course, for those of us who do those type of things, strategic planning, market research, those type of things, people should be reaching out to talk about these kind of things. And if you don't have somebody on staff do it, bring somebody in to do it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I was a strategy professor. My background of working for McKinsey and PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I did turnaround strategy consulting, and then McKinsey, I did higher level strategy work, including higher ed strategy work, and then teaching it for over 20 years. Strategy should drive all of this. Now I'm biased again with that kind of background, but a good strategy, a few tenets for us to employ. One is that we need to find our differentiation. Too much of higher ed is isomorphic, and we try to look just like others and try to do things the way others do. Quite frankly, the ranking system have kind of driven us this way because they said these are the things that we'll measure, therefore you should align with them. And somebody like Michael Crow at Arizona State has really said, we don't need to do it that way. We need to do it differently. For example, he uses strategy so well, and it's just a great role model for a lot of us. Now, we don't want to all emulate his strategy, but his core mission was to flip the mission of the institution to be less about exclusivity and more about inclusivity. We'll judge ourselves not by the percent we turn down when you look at a Harvard or a Stanford of 95%, but the percent we accept and how we move them and make them successful and with different approaches, with online instead of in person, with more student support, with different kinds of curriculum, different kinds of modalities. The starting point for good strategy is differentiation, and we need to push ourselves to be more like that. In fact, I think they're doing research about trying to get away from Carnegie classifications as well.
One can only hope.
Yeah, I mean,
one can only hope.
All of our models were helpful for a while, but you need to adjust those when macro forces change. That's another key part of strategy, is to pay attention to your world around you and make adjustments in what you do. We've been pretty isolated in higher ed. We have had some change, but certainly not as much as you see in other industries. And then, I've been thinking a lot about what they should use the money for. In fact, a number of my articles in the Chronicle speak to this, and they would adhere, even though I've been writing them over the past year, they still would apply now. I really see three big priorities. Now, each of these would vary based on the context of your own institution, but you should invest in students, efficient operations, and growth. And for students, it's things like career services. I've done research on that, not amenities, as we spoke to before, right, Drumm? Not the fancy stuff, but the core stuff that helps them figure out what they want to do. That affects retention, graduation, and post-employment income. Mm-hmm. So if you can get them more aligned earlier, Utah has done some amazing things in terms of career planning at the freshman level, at the first year level. Mental health, what a crisis.
Yes.
And that is going to continue to be a need for students. Admissions, you do have to invest to bring the students, to tell them what you have to offer and what's unique. So investing in students, but investing in the core things that make a difference, things like that. Also financial aid. At UNC Chapel Hill, we have a thing called the Carolina Covenant. Anyone who qualifies to come here but can't afford it, we pay for it. And we need to have every institution doing that kind of thing. I know that one of the next things we might see is free community college. That will have some dynamics on this, but students would be first. Efficient operations would be second. And we've just gone too long of just adding more FTEs. The old adage of whatever problem you have, just throw another person at it. That is not the way to solve efficiency. So I've seen organizations, when I was working with CFOs, make some good improvements, but we haven't done enough of it. We need to redo how we do things. We need to use IT strategically, take it to the cloud, eliminate redundancies. This is the thing that gets me. So many redundancies on a campus between central and decentral, doing the same thing, but just doing it locally, and then redundancies within a system. If you consolidate those things, consolidate HR, consolidate IT, consolidate finance, have fewer people doing it, but higher paid professionals doing it with technology, is a better model. Often universities have viewed themselves as employers, and that's okay, but that's not an efficiency model. So that's going to take a lot of work. And the last one is growth. You mentioned online programs. We still have room to grow in online, but it's getting pretty competitive. So you have to grow what's unique about your programs, what your institution has online. Also do it in partnership with other institutions so you can share in the marketing costs, but leverage your expertise. And then they got to find new revenue models. You got to find new products, new certificates, new research. You got to invest in ways to grow your research dollars, do more acquisitions. I see that we will have a lot of consolidation. Mergers and acquisitions should be part of your strategy. You can grow your student base through an acquisition or an affiliation, and I see that as a future trend. Sorry, I got on my rant there, Drumm, but those are some of the. I just hope that folks are thinking more on using their money for those kinds of things.
Well, let's do a little deeper dive on some of those. With respect to students, you touched on something that's really important, the student mental health, counseling services, things along those lines. But when we look at the changing demographics with the high school students, you mentioned earlier, a 15% decrease over the next 5 years. We need to be providing services for those adults who are going back to school. And I think Carol Aslanian did some research a while back. 74% of all students nowadays are post-traditional, i.e., they're not coming out of high school. They have different needs. And I don't think most institutions are really taking a look at what those needs are and how they can satisfy them.
No, you're on to something big there. The type of student is going to be different, and the needs of our current students are going to be different. So, we mentioned mental health, and I threw out career planning, but it's going to take a lot more than that to increase retention and graduation rates. And that's a real crazy part of our business model. If you're in an institution with 50 to 60% graduation rates, can you imagine having a product that people only finish half of? And the dollars invested in keep making them successful are going to be less expensive than trying to acquire new students, which, by the way, as we just mentioned, aren't going to be there anyway. So there has to be a whole new flip on what do we have to do to help them be successful. They need more support. It's going to cost more. This is an area to invest more money. I was talking about the efficiency sides, but you can also combine it with efficiency. Again, positives of the pandemic, if you could even say that, is that we have experimented with virtual service delivery. And mental health is one of those areas that is done through telemedicine, done through, my brother is an autism counselor, And he's been saying for years he wished that it would be more accepted to do counseling and training online instead of limiting the impact and the access because it has to be physical in person. Some of it should be, but not all of it. So if we just start from scratch in some of these cases, say, what do these students really need? Why aren't they graduating? And to a certain extent, we're going to have to go back in the supply chain into high school. Again, something Arizona State's doing, offering more classes, offering more prep work, offering more counseling at the high school level to have them be better prepared to be successful.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good idea. I know with the telemedicine, I've got a good friend of mine, Sanjeev Arora, who is the head of the ECHO project here at University of New Mexico, and they're going worldwide with telemedicine. It's huge. Why can't this type of stuff be brought more into higher ed?
And here's what I think is going to happen, John. What could happen is we take an example like that. It's pretty darn hard for a university to reinvent all these things themselves, to know how to become more efficient, to know how to do an online program well. You said it earlier, you have to open yourself up to assistance from private industry. There's been a cottage industry that grew up around the online. That's the OPMs, online program managers. They were essentially created because the universities were not adept at flipping that model and creating high quality content and then advertising it properly because it was such a different beast. So the online program managers came in, they charged 50 to 70% of the revenue, but to a certain extent, it's worth it. I created a strategy. I worked on a team that created a strategy for UNC Chapel Hill for online education. And we said, yeah, we should work with 2U, give them the revenue because we would have to incur those expenses too. Of course, they have to get their margin. I think I estimated about 20% more than what we would spend, but we don't have the big infrastructure and people that we're not very good at anyway. So let's partner more with industry. Let's outsource some of these things like telemedicine. What a great example. Don't try to do everything ourselves because we can't do it as efficiently. And also think of it more on a system level. There was a great article that talked about the consolidation from 4,000 to 50 mega institutions. And if you look at some parallels and corollaries in banking industry, airline industry, consolidation could make sense if you can get economies of scale, which should be there in terms of able to charge less but have higher quality outcomes. So that could be an interesting future.
Which takes us right into efficiency of operations. One of the things that you mentioned, and I've been talking about for a couple of years now, is the increased mergers and acquisitions, alliances that have been going on. They haven't happened at the same rate that I had expected they would be. But again, institutions wait too long generally before looking out there. They're in dire straits and nobody wants to acquire somebody who's got tons of debt on their balance sheet.
Here's one of the big barriers, I think, and a colleague of mine, Rick Beyer at AGB, is an expert at this, and he and I are just starting to get into this and start talking to universities about it. There are so many exit barriers. The idea of an acquisition in higher ed is just so foreign. In private industry, it takes place all the time. Big fish eats the smaller fish. That's the norm. My company, ABC Insights, was bought by Helio Campus, and I think our name has just been retired at about 7 months later. It took me 6 years, me and my two partners, to build this whole thing up. But that's the way it works. You got huge exit barriers in higher ed. All the alumni do not want to lose the name of their institution, right? I mean, that is a huge barrier. They will fight tooth and nail to keep Paul Drumm University from ever closing, even if it should have closed a decade ago. So you get an influx to fight the loss of that, even if it should take place. What I think has to happen is something more creative, and it's more affiliations. I'm working with some universities right now about a family of institutions. So you get some good strategic leadership. You get some, and it speaks to efficiencies. You get some good models for efficiency of operations, but you allow a local franchise front. So you can kind of keep that look and feel, but it's actually part of something bigger and it's run differently. So I kind of think we're going to have to see something like that. Even closures have the exit barriers. Just anything that loses the name, I think is tough. That's why I think you're going to have to see some flexible strategies around affiliations Rick Byer's been doing a lot of work in private institution affiliations or private systems. Put a number of them together and run them like a system, either giving up your equity and your control or not. There's all kinds of variances. The whole M&A thing is probably the wrong language. It's sort of like, how do we consolidate and work together?
And most higher ed institutions feel like if they go out for being acquired or some sort of alliance, that they failed. And that's not the way they should be thinking.
You're right. They should be thinking of it as we want to increase scale efficiencies. We want to add expertise to complement ours. You're right. I think it's a good way to put it, Drumm. It's too much viewed as a failure. But again, in private industry, it's not. An acquisition is a compliment. But yes, I see what you're saying, and we got to shift that mindset.
Absolutely. And of course, in higher ed, we've got a whole bunch of really smart people who don't want advice.
Yeah.
What do you say to that one?
Well, I mean, these are my colleagues you're talking about, but I can't disagree. They are tremendously smart people. The reason I'm hesitating is, do they want the advice? They don't think they need the advice, but maybe they do want it.
That's it right there.
So I don't know the exact answer, but knee-jerk reactions, you can't touch any of our programs. We can't do any academic cuts because that's our mission. Those are the wrong frameworks. Yeah. And it's faculty versus administration, cabinet versus the board. These are not going to help us. Every one of my articles I talk about, we need to collaborate. We need to find common ground. We need to have a defining vision and a problem statement that, like UNC Chapel Hill, we have a great president. And he came out and said, we got a $300 million gap we got to fill somehow. $200 million and then a structural deficit, $100 million due to our COVID situation. Let's go after it. You want to avoid across the board cuts at all costs. You want to only cut where you have excess. And that takes work, it takes some discipline to get there. We have to use data. We have to use benchmarking. Once you get your arms around that and you're able to have courage to say that's going to take a bigger hit or go away completely, and this is actually going to grow, then you can have good, productive conversations. But it has to be collegial. It has to be, which is truly part of our shared governance. Theoretically, is intended to be collegial, but it can't be versus.
Yeah, and I think that sums it up. 3 things, takeaways. I wish we had more time, but.
I got another 2 hours, Drumm. Let's extend this one.
Hey, let's keep going, baby. 3 takeaways for university presidents.
You got it. There's a theme to these in my mind. It's really leadership. I mean, the presidents are our leaders. And my first piece of advice is it's time to lead. There needs to be a sense of urgency. So my first one is now's the time. You have to be the one who leads the sense of urgency. And it doesn't mean be short term. It's got to be long-term perspective. But you've got to say, this is the time to change. We have a lot of pressure on us. You have the attention of campus. You have your board engaged. So the time, and I really fear if you don't make major changes within a year, there's gonna be a lot of pressure, inertia sneaking back in, and it's gonna make it harder. So my first thing, you need to have a sense of urgency. My second thing, be strategic. And what I mean by that is don't just revert to the original strategic plan. Many of them are pretty generic, quite frankly. Do service and research and teaching and be the best university. I mean, push yourselves to a very specific core differentiation. What are you most proud of? And a mission statement should be a thing you're proud of. Don't try to build everything you do in it. Just find a piece that really sets you apart. On my website, paulfriga.com, paulfriga.com, I have all kinds of examples of this and some slide decks on how to do this, because I spend a lot of time doing workshops, and you do too, Drumm, on this. But you got to have a really succinct mission. A vision is where you're going. That makes people excited. Values are what you believe in. Don't have any more than 3. If I see another list of 10 values, nobody's living them all. So, you got to have clarity about your statement. So the first one is urgency. The second one is be strategic. And what I mean by that is find your differentiation and have a crystal clear set of 3 priorities that you want everyone working on to move the university forward. Of course, you have a lot of operational initiatives and a bunch of operational priorities, but don't get those mixed up. You want the high-level stuff of how you're changing for the better. So that's the second piece. First one is urgency. 2 is strategic direction. And the third one is don't be incremental. 20% or more on every one of your priorities. If you got a priority about revenue, 20% growth in revenue. If you're increasing your operating model, 20% increase in net returns. Hold your tuition flat. Push yourself. That's what Mitch Daniels did at Purdue for a number of years. I think he's up to 5 years now he's been doing that. And he pushes his team to be more efficient as a result of it. So do some BHAGs. You remember those, Drumm?
Oh, yeah. Big, hairy, audacious goals.
That's it. I knew you would know that reference. Stretch yourself. This is not the time to just do incremental change. This is the time to say we can really become something. To me, strategy is going up a down escalator. I kind of equate it to my religion. I have my direction, I have what I'm shooting for, and I'm running up the steps. And if everybody's aligned and it's all clear, they're all moving. But as soon as you stop all that energy, you'll go backwards because competition goes forward, technology, macro forces, demands, all of that stuff. So keep your energy, keep excited. So those are my 3 pieces about a sense of urgency, strategic direction and clarity, and then stretch and not being incremental.
You sound like the UNC professor that you are. Excellent choices.
Well, I've been thinking about strategy for a long time, and my PhD's in strategy. But this to me is a dream come true. My father was a president of a community college. He's always encouraged me during his life and after his life to keep writing as much as possible. And I feel like there's a calling for me to be talking like this and to be helping higher ed because I think this is an incredible time and honestly an incredible opportunity to make the right kind of changes because it's not just for the institutions, it's for the students and it's for society.
And, that's part of why we both are part of AGB right now, the Association of Governing Boards. So what's next for you?
Oh, I don't sleep a whole lot because I'm always thinking about what's next. But the best place to go is to agb.org and look at the calendar of events. I know you're doing those as well. I do a lot of workshops, webinars. We have a huge national conference coming up in April that would be worthwhile for presidents and board members to attend. I'm doing a session on reimagining the public business model, the public higher ed business model. We've got another one on the private business model and other sessions that are just fantastic. But I'd say my signature event right now, I created a master class for NACUBO for CFOs when I was working with them. So now I've done the same thing for presidents and board members. It's called Strategic Transformation Workshops. And we do them on the last Wednesday of each month. And it's for presidents and board members. I'm honing in on public, but I will allow some privates to attend. I'll put them in their own discussion group. And it's an interesting format, Drumm. You would love it because it's interactive. So we have a plenary case study dive. Our first one is Michael Crow and Fred Duvall from Arizona State talking about their journey and how they think it's a time for a brand new public higher education model. And then we put all the leaders into discussion groups, smaller groups up to about 5 for 30 minutes to share their thoughts and their experiences, war stories. And then we have a 30-minute report out. So it's like a class. It's like executive education for presidents and board members. I just think it's going to be a really great forum. And we're getting a very good attendance for that. That's going to be every Wednesday. I've got the whole year's curriculum laid out, and it covers all the topics for what's needed in a transformation.
Well, I will see you there.
And I know you will, and you got the invite to it. The last thing I'll mention is another thing I got cooking. We can't announce it yet, but as a teaser, be looking for $1 million public higher education transformation challenge. $1 million in prizes sponsored by a well-known foundation that will go to the university that demonstrates the things I just talked about before, the BHAGs, the real impact, the real change. And even the process of finding these folks on a big website that people can go to and vote on and download is what our project's going to be, is going to be best practice sharing in and of itself. So it's going to be a year-long challenge, and it's going to conclude with a huge conference next May with some in-person sessions in DC, but also a virtual conference to share and announce the winners. And we'll give out the $1 million in prizes. So stay tuned for that. More information will be coming soon to a podcast near you.
Very good. Well, Paul, thanks so much for being on the show. This was wonderful, and I look forward to the next time we get a chance to do this.
And I look forward to working with you in a common mission to help higher ed through this transformation.
Thank you, sir. Take care.
Thanks for listening this week. And a special thank you to this week's special guest, Paul Friga, Associate Professor at the Kenan-Flagler School of Business at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a fellow senior consultant for the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges. I also want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, Perdea Education. Visit PerdeaEducation.com to learn how they can help you grow your online student enrollment through a performance-based model that has no risk or long-term contracts to your institution. Our next guest is Dr. Billy Hawkins, President of Talladega College. Billy will be joining us to talk about how Talladega College and HBCUs have approached the COVID crisis, what they're doing that will have them standing strong and viable for years to come. Some great lessons for all university presidents and their boards.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.